Hi there, I'm Zach Kircher, and you're watching Kircher Talks Entertainment. Sir Ridley Scott is no stranger to the idea of legacy sequels, having been previously involved with Prometheus, Alien Covenant, and Blade Runner 2049 to name some examples. And now he has given us Gladiator 2, a long-gestating legacy sequel that has finally arrived after spending more than 24 years in the oven. I try not to go into these legacy sequels hating them on principle right off the bat. After all, Top Gun Maverick turned out as well as it did, so it's always possible that something great can come out and surprise us all. A lot of times these movies do end up being useless retreads of what came before, but there's occasionally a great gem every now and then that shocks us all. This is why Gladiator 2 had me intrigued going into it. First and foremost, the movie already had a built-in advantage in that Ridley Scott himself was invested in the project, having directed the original that ended up winning big at the Oscars in 2001. Secondly, the story that was pitched in the marketing suggested that the creative team took the term legacy sequel quite literally. Oh, really quick by the way, Paramount Pictures is notorious for blocking videos even when they are justified in their fair use of copyrighted material, and so to avoid this video getting demonetized, whenever I feel it's appropriate, I'm just going to be overlaying some footage of Age of Empires over what I'm talking about, because hey, you know, it's a game about the Roman Empire, figure it fits. Anyway, this movie takes place 16 years after the events of the first film, picking up with Lucius, the son of Russell Crowe's Maximus and Connie Nielsen's Lucilla, in which he's living across the sea from Rome in the North African nation of Numidia. Rome eventually comes knocking though, in which an army led by Pedro Pascal's general Acacius lays siege upon the city, and Lucius's wife is among the casualties. Lucius is then captured and sold into slavery, specifically the kind of slavery that forces men to fight to the death in the Colosseum. Where have I seen this before? Again, I was willing to give this movie a shot in case it took some interesting directions with a familiar narrative, and in some ways, it does. You may come across some people who would be quick to claim that this film is a rehash of the first movie, when that's only half true. I wouldn't have even cared if this was essentially the same story as the original, as long as enough elements were unique enough to make it stand on its own 2 feet. The thing is that Gladiator 2 is split almost 50-50 between two different things for its overarching story, and it doesn't excel at accomplishing either one of its big goals. This is ultimately why it was a mixed bag for me, given that it's a case of Ridley Scott trying to have his cake and eat it too. I highlight Ridley Scott specifically in saying that, since big, bloated runtimes that still aren't enough to cover a beefy story have been a recurring problem in many of his movies, the most recent example being Napoleon starring Joaquin Phoenix. That movie's large scale benefits its ambitions as a historical epic for a contemporary audience, but even when the theatrical cut runs for well over 2 hours, the pacing is so scattershot that the plot threads and characters are not given enough room to breathe. In the act of attempting to cover so much, the movie accomplishes surprisingly little. It's only after the extended director's cut release that movies like Napoleon and Kingdom of Heaven received their second shot. Even the original Blade Runner was a case of the director's cut being a significantly better version of itself. With all of that in mind, Gladiator 2 is another example of a huge Ridley Scott production that underwhelms even when it has a long runtime. However, the issue with that is a little bit different this time around. Rather than being a single story that wasn't given enough time to feel complete, this came across as two different narratives Frankenstein together as a single product. Unfortunately for the film's sake, either half of the story has its merits and drawbacks. The first half, or more accurately the first 90 minutes or so, is highly familiar territory for anyone who has seen the original film. If you hear anyone complain that Gladiator 2 rehashes what came before, this sizable portion of the movie is what they're referring to. It's the epitome of what people think of when they learn that a beloved film from 20 to 30 years before is getting a sequel. Hollywood production teams may attempt to dress up these modern reboots with updated tech, throw some new actors into the mix, and twist some things with the story here and there, but at the end of the day, these movies will stick with what is tried and true. The end result may simply come across as a desperate attempt to recapture lightning in a bottle, which even the most casual moviegoer can pick up on. That's exactly the issue here, for more or less the same plot beats from the original are repeated, making the experience devoid of much surprise or intrigue. Even with that being the case though, there was potential with the characters and the actors portraying them. With a cast as stacked as this, with the likes of Denzel Washington, Connie Nielsen, and Pedro Pascal rounding out an ensemble headlined by Paul Mescal in the lead role, you would think that the script would give all of the talent something worthwhile to do. And that's partially true, for the material allows for Connie Nielsen to build a great deal upon what she did in the original film, Denzel had the absolute time of his life on set, and Pedro Pascal provides some much-needed nuance for a character who's supposed to be the object of Lucius's revenge. And as much as the first half of Gladiator 2 is covering familiar ground, at least the battle scenes are enjoyable. Historical accuracy be damned, Ridley Scott and his teams have always been skilled at piecing together breathtaking action that commands the screen. I mean, have you seen Black Hawk Down? Gladiator 2 certainly has the sufficient amount of scale, intensity, and gore to tread in its predecessor's footsteps, at least on a surface level. I could also tell what was going on for the majority of the time, which isn't something I can 100% say about the original, as good as it may be. Some of the CGI for certain creatures involved in this gladiatorial combat is a bit questionable, but it's forgivable considering that the gargantuan budget is very evident in other ways like the lavish costumes and massive sets. All of this is to say that the first half of the movie has the grandeur and even, dare I say it, entertainment value you would hope for, but it just doesn't match up to what we got with the original back at the turn of the millennium. It really pains me to say this, but either half of the story hinges on Paul Mescal's Lucius being a compelling hero, and he just isn't. The fact that I'm even saying that is an unfair jab at the actor himself, since Paul Mescal is a proven talent, given that he got a well-deserved Oscar nomination for Aftersun just shy of his 27th birthday. This material does not do him any favors though, since the story arguably forces his character Lucius to live up to a legacy that he never asked for. That conflict would have been more interesting if the film depicted Lucius grappling with the implications of living up to Maximus's legacy, similar to Paul Atreides being gassed up as the Lisan al-Gaib in Dune Part 2 from earlier this year. But that's not what this story does. Both the movie on a conceptual level and even the characters within said story are trying to make Lucius out to be someone that he isn't, or rather, something that Lucius doesn't seem to be actively trying to become. That's the key for why this story worked much better in the original Gladiator, since Maximus's motive was clear. He was a proactive hero who worked hard to change his circumstances and expose the cracks in Rome's foundation. By contrast, when you have these genuinely interesting characters like Acacius and Lucilla juxtaposed against what is essentially a dollar store Maximus, who doesn't even have much of an issue with his manufactured destiny, the result doesn't end up being that satisfying. Now, once the film reaches a certain point roughly 90 minutes in, admittedly it does get a lot more interesting. This is the point where the story diverts into something much different than the recycling of plot beats from the original film. That fact in and of itself is commendable, since I appreciated the attempt to take the story in bold directions. There is also a genuine sense of unpredictability, given how wacky the political intrigue and violence gets in the latter hour of the film. And yet, remember what I said earlier about this movie being two plots stitched together into a single, gargantuan entity? Well, to put it lightly, this movie doesn't have anywhere near enough time to flesh out the plot points that are introduced in this last hour. Having known that Ridley Scott wants to make a third Gladiator film going into my screening, that made the last hour even more frustrating for me, because Gladiator 2 practically resolved all of its major plot points by the time the credits rolled. And it's not like the resolutions of said plot points were satisfying, they simply weren't granted the time and development to ring true by the end. Would Gladiator 2 have benefited from being longer? If it was assembled together in the editing room better and the editor retained the same story? Perhaps. However, consider this. A sequel to a movie whose ending already had perfect amounts of closure was pushing it, and after seeing how Gladiator 2 actually turned out, I would be even more skeptical of what ground to cover in a third film. This movie's ending wraps things up pretty succinctly for the most part. There is possibly a story that could be told, but again, the character of Lucius as he is written in this film doesn't exactly leave me chomping at the bit to see where his journey takes him. After all, it's not so much his own journey, but one that is largely motivated by forces outside of himself. Ultimately, if this plan to make Gladiator into a trilogy was to work, I think Ridley Scott and company should have taken a risk by making one big story split into two distinct parts. In other words, what we got with Gladiator 2 should have been told with two films instead of one. With all of the ground that this screenplay tries to cover, extending the story to two movies of a roughly 2-hour length would have, at least in theory, been enough to properly explore the points that the story tries to make. The relationships between characters could have had a greater impact, character growth would have made more sense, the themes could have been deeper, and each grand moment would have felt earned. Still, there's not much use dwelling on what could have been. As it stands, Gladiator 2 is a movie that tries a lot of things, succeeding with some and underwhelming with many others. You can certainly watch this movie and have some fun with it on a surface level, but again, it's a sequel to friggin' Gladiator we're talking about here. Even with all of the talent both in front of and behind the camera that brought this vision to life, it was lacking. I guess you could say I was only somewhat entertained, Maximus. Anyway, that's it. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this review, please leave a like and subscribe to the channel. For doing so really does help me out, and I'll see you all in the next one.